Gen X has waited 40 years for these action figures to finally appear in some form or another. And of course, it had to be Hasbro.
I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
If you've been following RetroBlasting for any length of time, you know that we consider Dungeons and Dragons to be one of the best Saturday morning cartoons of the 80s, if not one of the best Saturday morning cartoons ever. Great animation, great story, great characters, amazing plot twists, and the tragedy of not being able to complete its story because of short-sighted television broadcaster decisions.
I guess apologies won't make any difference now.
There were never any toys, and if you go back and look at our retrospective from a few years ago, you'll know that while this show was on TV, they had the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line out in stores, which had very little to do with this, apart from a few crossover characters and the dragon Tiamat. But there were no characters made of these heroes, who have become so iconic that one of the greatest bits of retro nostalgia that's happened in the last few years is a car commercial from South America that did more justice for this cartoon than even the stupid cameo in the recent official Dungeons & Dragons movie. But the big question I had was, it's Hasbro. They're doing their 6-inch thing again. How are these figures going to hold up and stack up against other offerings of other franchises? First of all, let me just point out that even though these Dungeons & Dragons figures were made in Hasbro's brief delusional era of no plastic bubbles on the cardbacks, these are some of the nicest cardbacks as far as the artwork I've seen in a long time. And it's a real shame, because if they had put actual clear plastic display bubbles on these, combined with the card art they used, these could have been figures of the year. But that's assuming you keep them on the bubble and never take them out and actually examine what they can and can't do. And that's where the shortcomings really start with the Hasbro Dungeons & Dragons figure line. Before we preoccupy ourselves with the specifics of these figures here, I just want to point out that I will not be reviewing or talking about the Venger Dungeon Master Target exclusive 2-pack that came out at the same time. Why? Because it was $50 at the time, it was way overpriced for what they were offering, and with the quality control issues that were plaguing the first wave of the heroes themselves that were chronicled by Pixel Dan and others, there was really no incentive to go out and plunk down $50 for that when I wasn't gonna spend $25 a figure on these guys. But fortunately, I found over half of this set available at steep discount at Ollie's. So I felt like, okay, I can get the figures of the heroes, and then I'll try and track down Venger and Dungeon Master later. But as far as I'm concerned, much like the classic arcade X-Men, these would be the playable characters in an arcade game. They are the heroes of the story. So my priority on getting that last 2-pack is very low. I'll try and get it later if I can, but they seem to be more display finishers for this group. I don't find them to be essential. So as I stated a second ago, there were quality control problems with these figures right out of the gate, specifically wrists just snapping off and other limbs. And when I got these, I knew that I was getting them at over 50% off, so I thought I'm willing to take the risk, try and boil them in water and get them moving at that price, and if something happens, then I'll do a repair. But at $24.99, that wasn't going to be a fun prospect if they broke. So I was originally not going to buy these figures at all, but then I found, like I said, half of them on discount, like steep discount. I thought, all right, I've been waiting 40 years like everybody else for these characters. I'll take a chance on that price. And these must have been later run figures that, were part of an additional batch or something that never made it to first run retail, because they had improved the durability of the wrists, they had improved the durability of the boot swivels and everything like that. I didn't even have to boil Hank, Bobby, or Diana to get them to work right. Now, all that being said, do they feel like robust action figures as far as the joints and overall durability in the long term? No. These figures have articulation almost as a simulation, almost as if Hasbro was saying, well, we're going to make something that walks like an action figure and talks like an action figure, but isn't quite actually an action figure as far as durability, usable posability, things like that. It's more of a nostalgic simulation of an action figure. Yes, technically, these are action figures. They have bendable knees, they have bendable arms, but they can't do much with them. And the joints that are there do feel very wibbly wobbly. They feel like, you muscle these too much, you could just snap off a limb. Like, so far that hasn't happened, but I've had to be really careful, not just because of what I've heard and seen in photographs happening to these figures, but because in general, these figures don't feel like they're made of a kind of plastic that can be coaxed with a little bit of firm determination to move. And that can be a really scary feeling when you're talking about figures that some of these figures, the last half of them, Sheila and Eric and Presto, I ended up paying basically full price off of Big Bad Toy Store to secure them before they sold out, because I wasn't certain that they would ever be at a discount store, because I never saw these at first run retail. My point about the articulation is not only does it feel not the strongest in the world, despite no breakages having occurred in the set that I have, the articulation isn't useful for these figures either. So, prime example, Hank cannot hold the energized accessory of his bow properly to pull an arrow. And you would think that they would have prioritized that pose with the articulation. In other words, you would think they would have said, you know what, regardless of anything else this character can do outside the basic articulation that we would give any action figure, we need to make sure that Hank can hold his bow properly for a good bowstring pull pose on display. Did Hasbro do that? No, they did not. And they even show him on the back of the package holding a bowstring the way nobody would hold it, with his hand above the arrow, because the people at Hasbro don't know anything about anything.
And retracting feature, oh, that's a lot of fun. Closely mimics an actual whip. It's very safe though.
As another example, Sheila comes with two versions of her cloak. She has one version of her cloak with the hood down. And then she has another version where you pop the head off, put her head in the hood, pop the head back on the body after you've put a cloak on that looks like it's disappearing from the ground up to make it look like she's turning invisible. Well, her one move in the show was flipping her hood up. Can her elbows and her hands get to the hood so that you can pose her like she's just pulled her hood up? No, you cannot. Let's take Bobby, for example. Bobby has that massive magical club. Can he actually hold it with two hands? Can he get his arms around so that his hands can meet up so that he can wield it with two hands? No, he can't. A lot of the characters have the softer PVC tunic extensions that go below their belts, and in the case of Presto, all the way to his ankles. Are these figures very posable and dynamic? Not really in that regard. I would have almost wished for softer goods, because that would have allowed you to do more dynamic things with them when you put them in a group on the shelf. But PVC is all the rage these days because I guess it looks aesthetically uniform, but it doesn't do the action figures themselves any favors in allowing them to look dynamic and do varied types of things. Take Diana's articulation, for example. It seems like she has a lot of articulation, and she's the acrobat, so she should be able to do some of the most dynamic things of all these action figures, but unfortunately, they didn't put the money into giving her the articulation she needed. So you kind of guesstimate and get close enough to a pose, but it still looks super awkward because her limbs can't do what they need to do. It's a letdown. It's a real letdown. These are another group of nostalgia bait action figures that overall look colorful and look the part, but it's another Hasbro group of stand around guys. Like, these are meant to be bought at a high premium price and then basically just stand around on a shelf. Hasbro is trying to give us the semblance of a premium package. Oh, we've got, alternate accessories, and we're giving you a set of Dungeons & Dragons role-playing dice that go with them. So if you collect all 6, you get the 6 classic types of Dungeons & Dragons dice. You get a full complement, but uniquely colored to be specific to this retro cartoon set. There's the illusion of effort that's gone into these, but Hasbro didn't put the faith behind it. So they gave them this high price point. Then they had the quality control issues on top of that, which drove even more people from this generation of toys away, all of whom really wanted this set. Everybody's been looking forward to and dreaming of a Dungeons & Dragons cartoon heroes set for 40 years. And what happened? First, the price point was too high for some. It was like, really? Then they didn't have the display bubbles, so that sent a lot of other people running away from this line. Then they had the quality control issues on top of that, so everybody was understandably reticent to buy into this. And that is a shame, because this is probably the last-ditch effort to get good Dungeons & Dragons figures from this cartoon, because Hasbro owns Dungeons & Dragons, and they've been keeping this depiction under lock and key forever. Remember, this is the company behind the recent Dungeons & Dragons movie, and instead of actually making a movie that adapted this cartoon and giving us the compelling characters that everybody remembers when you say the words Dungeons & Dragons, they relegated them to a weird, half-hearted cameo. Will they really make these again? And better? Doubtful. And it's not as if they had a team that was completely tone deaf to what was needed. You know, you get Bobby with a pack-in uni with a posable head, and that's about it. But at least Uni is included, and with the correct character who cared about Uni the most out of all the characters. You get an effort here where they want to give you alternate accessories for every character so that you can sort of get some display variety. So you have a staff for Diana that's basic, and then you have the staff that's supposed to look like it's in mid-twirl. Probably a waste of time, because Diana's staff most of the time was simply glowing and in her hands, and so the basic one is going to do you for that. You have the aforementioned invisibility cloak, which your mileage may vary on that. You have a PVC piece that can go around Eric's shield to make it look like he's actually using it to create some kind of magic aura. It's okay, but like with Diana's staff, Eric's shield is probably going to look better just unaffected. Presto has this very involved set of alternate accessories where you have one version of his hair that can accommodate wearing the hat. Then you have a swappable hairpiece so that it doesn't look like he has this big plug sticking out of his head, so that he can hold the hat and have either the beginnings of a spell or a full-on spell coming out of it. And this spell wave can be used almost independently and hooked to his wrist to make it look like he's throwing a spell out. And then finally, you've got Hank's accessories, as I described before. You have the basic bow, and then you have the energized bow. It's a shame, because the energized bow is what you'd want to display, but Hank can't hold it properly, so he can't strike an exciting pose with it at all. In fact, it just looks really dumb in his hands, so you're relegated to him holding the non-energized bow, which is nicely sculpted, so that's fine, but it doesn't allow you to really pull off the Dungeons & Dragons group shot that we're all familiar with. Last but not least, we have the sculpting. Now, the first thing I want to say is, individually, these figures are not impressive. Together, with all the colors and everything that they accurately depicted, they do look good as a finished group. Like, they do look good just from an initial curb appeal. But when you lean in and you start to look at them, you realize there's like an uncanny valley effect going on, where they wanted to get the cartoon look correct, but instead of actually going for the animation as it was, I don't know why Hasbro did this, but when you look at them, there's something off where they leaned into a Disney aesthetic rather than an actual Dungeons & Dragons animated show aesthetic. There's a margin of error there that is messing with the end depictions for the face sculpts especially. And when you look at Diana and you look at Eric, you can really see it. There is this Disney-fied kind of version going on. It's not as evident with Bobby and Sheila. And Presto's, he's okay. Hank, he kind of walks between those two groups, where he's not completely Disney, but he doesn't quite make it into the original animation either. They're trying to give him like this parted-lipped smile, but from most angles it looks like he's wearing white frosted lipstick when those are supposed to be his teeth. So yeah, it doesn't quite come together. The result overall is a group of figures that do look decent on display, provided that you are okay with 6 figures that basically just stand there. You can't really do a lot to make that group look wow. Like, they're standing there, they're finally represented in plastic, they've got the general deco and the general dialed in look for each character that makes them recognizable to what they're supposed to be. But there are corners cut here. There are elements that were missed, and there were other essential elements, like the articulation needs for specific characters, that they could have done better and clearly chose not to. The cardbacks, the artwork is fabulous, but that cardboard box glued onto the front of it because they didn't want to use a display bubble is really a shame, because that means that mint on card collectors are going to have little to no interest in this otherwise. And I don't blame them. I really don't. Overall, these were overpriced, under-engineered and not quality controlled properly. So unless you are just a Gen Xer that has never been able to let go of not having Dungeons & Dragons cartoon hero figures from 40 years ago, and you just want something on your shelf, I understand why these were a pass for most people. They're okay as a stand-around group, but that's about all they're going to do. And as far as the ultimate end feeling I have for it, to borrow from the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon mythology, these right here, they didn't get me home.